and Bendy.
Hello and welcome to Waldy and Bendy's Adventures in Art. I'm Bendy, the art historian also known as Dr. Bendor Grosvenor, and I'm usually joined by Waldy, also known as Waldemar Januszczak, the Sunday Times art critic. But he's still away catching up on other projects, so this week it's just me again, bringing you your regular art historical fix. What I thought we'd do today is take a deep dive into one of the most fascinating pictures ever painted. It's the Wilton Diptych, made more than 6 centuries ago in the 1390s. It's a jewel of English medieval art and a remarkable window into how kingship was imagined in late 14th century England. And it's not just a beautiful object, it's also a really mysterious one. For centuries, art historians have argued over what it shows and why it was made and who might have painted it. So I'd like to tell you its story and see whether we can make some sense of its deeper meaning. A quick practical note before we begin. The Wilton Diptych belongs to the National Gallery, and they've got an excellent high-resolution photograph of it on their website. You can zoom right down to the tiniest brushstrokes. So if you'd like to follow this discussion visually, just search for Wilton Diptych and zoom along as we go. Or you can watch this episode on Waldemar's YouTube channel, ZCZ Films, but you don't have to do either. If you're out walking or driving, I will describe everything we see. This is intended very much to be an audio experience. By the way, in case you're wondering why it's called the Wilton Diptych, for a long time it belonged to the Earls of Pembroke at Wilton House, and the name stuck. But we don't really need to worry about provenance too much today. So what I'd like to do is this. First, I'll describe the painting and point out some of its key features. Understanding always begins with looking. And then we'll step back and think about why it was made and what it might mean. The Wilton Diptych is a small portable altarpiece. It's made up of 2 wooden panels, each about 53 by 37 centimetres, and they're hinged together like a book. The panels are painted on both sides. When it's closed, you see the outer surfaces. And when it's opened, you see the inner devotional image. Let's begin with the outside. And it matters because it tells us immediately who the Wilton Diptych was made for. On the left-hand panel, we see the Royal Arms of England. This is the 3 lions that you'll still recognise today from, say, an England football top. But here they're also combined with the fleur-de-lis of the French royal coat of arms, and that's a reminder that English kings then claimed somewhat tenuously to also be kings of France. On the right-hand panel we see a white hart. A hart is an archaic word for a mature stag, and this white hart lies on a grassy, flower-strewn ground. Around its neck is a chain and a collar shaped like a crown. The pairing of the royal arms and the white hart leaves us and contemporary viewers in no doubt who this painting belonged to or was made for. It was King Richard II, who ruled England from 1377 to 1399. The white hart was Richard's personal badge. Heraldry mattered a great deal in this period. Kings and nobles plastered their symbols everywhere. Today we would think of them as brands. And actually, Richard's white hart still has brand value today. You may know that a popular name for a pub in England is still the White Hart. This goes back to Richard's reign, and a law passed in 1393 requiring anywhere that brewed and sold ale to display a sign. This is the beginning of the pub sign, and at the time many inns and pubs chose the badge of the then King Richard. So if you come across a pub called the White Hart, it may in fact be quite ancient. Now, this is a good moment to say something about Richard II himself, because his story is inseparable from this painting. Richard came to the throne in 1377 at the age of 10, succeeding his grandfather, Edward III. We're in the middle of the 100 Years' War with France, but at a point when England was on one of its losing streaks. So we're midway between Edward III's great victory at the Battle of Crécy and Henry V's great triumph at the Battle of Agincourt. Richard's own military record was fairly unremarkable, but his reign was punctuated by moments of extraordinary drama and personal courage, most notably during the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which we'll be coming back to. At the same time, Richard proved an erratic and increasingly autocratic ruler, provoking repeated rebellions. He was accused of tyranny, and in 1399 he was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. William Shakespeare, in one of his greatest history plays, presents Richard as a vain and insecure, but also cultured and poetic man. He gives him many unforgettable lines, including the famous Hollow Crown monologue. That's the one with the haunting passage, "Let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings." Before we leave the outside of the diptych, there's one further detail on it that matters a great deal. On the left-hand side of Richard's royal coat of arms, we see a cross surrounded by 5 birds. These are not the standard royal arms of England. They belong to Edward the Confessor, the second last Anglo-Saxon king and the only English royal saint. Richard admired Edward the Confessor intensely, so much so that he incorporated Edward's arms into his own. The heraldic term for this is quartering, and this gives us a crucial clue to the date of the painting. We know Richard only began quartering Edward the Confessor's arms in 1395, so the Wilton Diptych cannot have been made before then, when Richard was in his late 20s. So that's the outside. Before we move to the inside, this is probably a good time to tell you a little bit about the painting's technique. First of all, it's executed in egg tempera, which is a precursor to oil paint, in which the pigment was mixed with an egg binder. Now, because tempera doesn't flow like oil paint, it requires lots of small strokes. In skilled hands, this allows for extraordinary precision, like you see in a manuscript illumination or a portrait miniature. Behind the figures in the Wilton Diptych, we see a gold background. Sometimes it's plain, like on the outside, but on the inside it's incised with thousands of tiny punch marks which may form stars or leaves and flowers. Most devotional paintings of the period were so-called gold ground paintings like this. They were meant to seem magical. The contrast between the realistic figures and the luminous gold background suggesting an encounter between earthly and heavenly realms. Now let's open the diptych and have a look inside. Imagine it placed on an altar before you, opened for prayer, perhaps glowing in candlelight. On the left-hand side of the panel we see 4 figures in a landscape setting. 3 of them are standing, each with a halo, and they're gesturing towards a 4th figure who kneels before them. He has no halo. He's shown in profile, facing to the right, with his arms outstretched as if he's offering something or receiving something. And we'll go straight to this kneeling figure because he's the star of the show. It's Richard II again. We know this because he wears a crown and a red cloak embroidered with his badge, the White Hart. Around his neck hangs a magnificent gold chain decorated again with a white heart and small golden broom pods. A broom pod was the seed head of the broom plant, and in Latin that plant is called Planta genista. So this is probably a visual pun on the Plantagenet dynasty to which Richard belonged. But the broom pods may mean something else as well. They were also used as the personal badge by the King of France at the time, Charles VI. And in 1396, around the time the Wilton Diptych was made, England and France agreed a truce in the 100 Years' War, which was sealed by Richard's marriage to Charles's daughter, Isabel. Now, this was very much, at least in the initial stages, just a diplomatic match because Isabel was 6 and Richard was 29, And though it's true they did things differently back then, there was no intention of the marriage being a marriage in the conventional sense for many years. But it was an important moment. Gifts were exchanged, and we know that Charles VI gave Richard a gold chain with broom gods, quite similar to the one we see here in the painting. Before we move on, there's something we must notice about Richard. He looks very young. He doesn't have a beard. He's not quite a child, but he's certainly not an adult. He's more like a boy in his early teens. Now, we'll come back to this important point later on. Standing behind Richard are three saints, all bearded. On the left is St. Edmund, the Anglo-Saxon king of East Anglia who was martyred by the Vikings. He's identified by a crown, ermine robes, and a large arrow piercing his body, an affliction he seems to bear with remarkable composure. Next to him stands Edward the Confessor, also crowned and robed, and holding his attribute, which is a ring. This is a ring which, according to legend, he'd given in charity to a beggar one day, who later revealed himself to be St. John the Evangelist. Now, Richard II was deeply devoted to Edward the Confessor. Nowadays, in our more agnostic age, it can be hard to understand just how deeply religion and politics were intertwined in the medieval period. But for Richard, they were indivisible, and he believed completely that he was God's anointed and in the power of the saints. William Shakespeare captures this belief perfectly when he gives Richard the line, "Not all the water in the rough rude sea can wash the balm from an anointed king." Edward the Confessor provided Richard with a powerful model. He was a king chosen by God and a saint. And Richard made repeated pilgrimages to Edward the Confessor's tomb in Westminster Abbey, especially at moments of crisis. On occasion, he would even walk to and from the shrine barefoot. Now, normally when you see representations of Edward the Confessor from this period, he appears alongside St. John the Evangelist, to whom, as we've just heard, he'd given his ring. But here, the third saint is in fact St. John the Baptist, and he's identified by the lamb he's holding, the Lamb of God. Unlike the two previous saintly kings, John wears rough clothing. His hair and beard are obviously quite wild. His arms are bare, and you can even see the veins beneath his skin, quite raised. They're painted with the most astonishing delicacy. Important to note here that St. John the Baptist was Richard's patron saint. All three saints and Richard are looking towards the right-hand panel, so let's look at that side of the picture now. Here we see the Virgin Mary holding the infant Christ, who appears to be reaching out to bless Richard on the other side of the picture. Mary and Christ are surrounded by a glorious array of 11 winged angels, set against a gold background decorated with stars. The angels wear white heart badges, so they're clearly identified with Richard, and some even resemble Richard himself, which is probably not a coincidence. And like Mary, they're clothed in vivid blue gowns, which were painted with ultramarine. Now, this was an expensive pigment made from ground-up lapis lazuli stone, which was imported from what was then simply known as beyond the seas, hence ultramarine, but which we now know to be Afghanistan. There's one last detail here. One angel in the picture holds up a banner bearing the red cross of St. George, and at the tip of this banner is a tiny representation of an island. This is England. In the later Middle Ages, England was often described as Mary's dowry, the Virgin's special possession. We know Richard believed this fervently, because a similar diptych in which he featured, but which is now sadly lost, bore the inscription, "This is your dowry, Holy Virgin, wherefore rule over it, Mary." So we've described the painting there in some detail. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we can ask the obvious question. What does it all mean?
Waldy and Bendy.
Welcome back. We're discussing the Wilton Diptych, one of the great masterpieces of English medieval art. Art historians have been puzzled by this picture for a long time. In 1997, an entire book was devoted to it, but it concluded that The only certainty in the Wilton Diptych is that it shows King Richard II being presented to the Virgin and Child by Saints Edmund, Edward, and John the Baptist. The rest is conjecture. Now let's see if a little bit more historical context can add to that conjecture. At a basic level, I think the message of the picture is clear enough. Richard is represented as a divinely sanctioned king, blessed by Christ, the Virgin, saints and angels, and this fits with what we know of his personal beliefs, and it's also reflected in other works of art that were made during his reign. In Westminster Hall, for example, just over the road from Westminster Abbey and part of Richard's main palace, we see a series of full-length statues of English kings which were commissioned by Richard, starting with Edward the Confessor and ending with himself. And they were made to be displayed under a new hammer-beam roof in Westminster Hall, which was lined with 26 carved angels, looking very like the ones we see in the Wilton Diptych, which held Richard's coat of arms. They were meant to provide a kind of heavenly guard for Richard's earthly court below. And you can still see these angels and some of those stone statues in Westminster Hall today. But art historians have always looked for more specific meanings in the Wilton Diptych, something a little deeper. A popular theory is that it's a kind of adoration of the Magi, with Richard as one of the three kings. And it's true, his birthday was on the Feast of Epiphany, January 6th. Another theory is that it was made after Richard died and shows his entry into heaven. There are many others, but for me, none of them quite explain everything in the picture. And there is that one detail that refuses to go away, the fact that Richard is shown as a boy. This is odd, because the heraldry and the scientific dating of the panel and the possible French connection tell us that the painting must have been made in the mid to late 1390s, when Richard was in his late 20s and when we know he wore a beard. A contemporary full-length portrait of him, which still survives in Westminster Abbey, and in my view is likely from the same workshop as the Wilton Diptych, shows him looking very much his true age, and again he has a beard. So the question is, why does the Wilton Diptych show him as a teenager? To answer that, I think we need to step back, not just from the painting itself, but step back into Richard's reign, and go back to its defining moment, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. This, at least to my mind, is the context that best fits the painting. The causes of the Peasants' Revolt were many, but its roots lay in the Black Death. This terrifying plague, which first struck England in 1348, killed, after repeated waves, around half the population. And the Black Death also profoundly affected the English economy, because with workers scarce, wages rose, and the ruling classes resisted paying workers more. First of all, they tried to fix wages by law, then they brought in immigrant labour, and they also did things like shift towards sheep farming to cater for the booming wool trade, because sheep required far less labour. And this meant in turn that common land was enclosed by not only the aristocracy, but the church. By the late 14th century, the life of an English peasant was therefore pretty bleak. Half the people you knew had been killed by the Black Death, your wages were suppressed, immigrants competed for jobs, and the land you depended on was being taken from you. The final spark was a poll tax levied in 1380, 12 pence on everyone over the age of 15. This was meant to fund another war in France, but it was deeply unpopular. Riots followed, and in June 1381, a large army of rebels marched on London. They stormed the city, they stormed the Tower of London, and in there they found the Archbishop of Canterbury. They beheaded him and they stuck his head on a pike. They did similar to all sorts of other officials. Immigrants particularly were attacked, with over 150 murdered, mainly immigrants from Flanders. And the rebels used to go around testing people's nationality by asking them to say the words bread and cheese. And if you pronounced bread and cheese with a Flemish accent, brood and käse, then you were killed. It was quite clear that the government had lost all control. Eventually it was clear also that only one person could resolve the situation, Richard II, then just 14 years old. On the 15th of June he agreed to meet the rebels at Smithfield, just outside the city gates, and hear their demands. But before he went to the meeting, he visited Westminster Abbey. And it's here that we need to pay special attention to his movements with regard to the Wilton Diptych. First, he visited St. Edward the Confessor's shrine, where he prayed for a long time. Then he made an offering at the high altar, and he took confession. And this sequence suggests that he knew the risks to his life were great. For one final prayer, he visited a small side chapel in Westminster Abbey called Our Lady in the Pew, which is immediately beside Edward the Confessor's tomb. And here, according to the French chronicler Jean Froissart, stood a statue of the Virgin Mary, which did great miracles, and in whom the kings of England, says Froissart, had ever greater trust and confidence. Now, the chapel of Our Lady in the Pew still survives in Westminster Abbey to this day. You can go and stand outside the gate and peer into it. It's about the size of 2 telephone boxes. Look closely, and you can still see the empty niche where a statue of the Virgin Mary once stood. And above it are faint traces of a painting of a white hart, Richard's badge. So this was clearly a space that Richard wished to be personally associated with. And that might also be because it's immediately beside another side chapel, that of St. John the Baptist, Richard's patron saint. And opposite it, on the other side of Edward the Confessor's tomb, is another chapel of one of the saints we know Richard was keen on, St. Edmund. Now, these 4 figures, the Virgin Mary, Edward the Confessor, John the Baptist, and St. Edmund, all appear in the Wilton Diptych. Now, after Richard had made his final prayers before the statue of the Virgin Mary in Westminster Abbey, we're told that he leapt on his horse and rode out to Smithfield. There, the rebel leader, Wat Tyler, approached to present his demands. And there was an exchange of words, and then, abruptly, a scuffle. Wat Tyler was stabbed by one of the king's attendants, and as he lay dying, he called on his supporters to avenge him. One chronicler says the rebels even began to bend their bows, and had they decided to shoot, their greater numbers would surely have won the day. But Richard, in a moment of immense bravery, rode directly towards them. "Sirs," he shouted, "what aileth you? You shall have no captain but me. I am your king. Be all in rest and in peace." And to everyone's astonishment, they agreed, interpreting his remarks, mistakenly it later turned out, as a pledge to abolish serfdom. And soon the rebel army began to disperse. When Richard returned to Westminster that day, he said to his mother, Joan of Kent, "Rejoice yourself and thank God. I have this day recovered mine heritage and the realm of England, the which I had near lost." And this was true, for Richard had personally saved everything the English state then stood for. How had he done it? Imagine for a moment that you are Richard, a medieval king of 14 who's faced down an army and lived to tell the tale. In a society saturated with religious belief, it would have been quite easy to see such a victory as miraculous. The work of God, the Virgin Mary, and the saints whose help you sought in Westminster Abbey that very morning. And once you believed that, once you accepted it, it could hardly fail to shape the way you saw your own authority, and perhaps in time to find its way into paint. This is the belief and the moment that the Wilton Diptych records. Politically, this belief manifested itself in Richard's increasing autocracy. In 1397, he attempted to abolish Parliament, which had refused to bend to his will. The Wilton Diptych is made in the late 1390s, when once again Richard's authority is under threat, as it had been during the Peasants' Revolt, and when he needs to believe that heaven is once more on his side. But this time, it wasn't. It was one thing for Richard to portray himself as a semi-divine youth, quite another to rule as one. Contemporary critics of Richard's final years mention his juvenile manner. One wrote about the boy king in his boyish ways. And in 1399, Richard was deposed by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. He was forced to surrender his crown in Westminster Hall, beneath that great hammer-beam roof, with its rows of guardian angels holding Richard's coat of arms. William Shakespeare, in his play Richard II, portrays Richard as initially at ease with the prospect of Henry Bolingbroke's rebellion. And he tells his supporters not to be concerned, saying, "For every man that Bolingbroke hath pressed to lift shrewd steel against our golden crown, God for his Richard hath in heavenly pay a glorious angel. Then, if angels fight, weak men must fall, for heaven still guards the right." But in the end, nobody fought for Richard. No nobles, no peasants, no saints, and certainly no angels, whether real or painted. A year later, he starved to death in Pontefract Castle. So the Wilton Diptych is a painting that Richard believed told a miraculous story. And today, to us, to borrow Shakespeare's phrase, it tells a sad story of the death of kings. There remains the question of who painted the Wilton Diptych, and indeed where it was painted. I'm afraid we don't have much time to pursue this in any depth. In the early 20th century, British scholars tended to be rather protective of it and insisted it had to be English. But the painful truth is that England did not then, for various reasons, have many artists good enough to paint something like the Wilton Diptych. Today, opinions are less nationalistic. Italian, French and German hands have all been proposed by art historians. The National Gallery hedges its bets, describing it simply as English or French, ? Making attributions these days is unfashionable in art history, but even so I think it's worth hazarding a guess, if only for fun. My own view is that it's likely by a French artist. Among the very small number of leading French artists known to have worked in England, or whose work was present there, is one called André Beauneveu. He was a versatile figure, a sculptor, a manuscript illuminator, and a painter. The chronicler Jean Froissart, who visited England twice, tells us that Beauneveu was known there, though whether that means he worked in England or simply that his works were admired and collected is not entirely clear. What makes the suggestion tempting is that a closely comparable kind of diptych by Beauneveu survives. It's in a French manuscript known as the Brussels Hours, which is now in the Royal Library of Belgium. On one page it shows the Duke de Berry kneeling before two saints, in a scene very much like the one we see on the left-hand panel of the Wilton Diptych. And on the facing page we see the Virgin and Child. Now, the Duke de Berry was for some time the regent of France, and after the marriage of Richard and Isabel in 1396, he was a relation of Richard's by marriage, and we know the two exchanged gifts, and we know that André Beauneveu worked for the Duke de Berry. So perhaps then Beauneveu was sent to England to paint Richard, or perhaps he painted Richard when Richard was in France. Now, this is a subjective judgment, of course. But to my eye, there are enough stylistic affinities between Beauneveu's known work and the Wilton Diptych to make the comparison worth considering. Have a look for yourself and see what you think. Thanks very much for listening to this discussion on the Wilton Diptych. If you'd like to have any tips for further reading, the book I mentioned, published in 1997, all about the painting, is called The Regal Image of Richard II and the Wilton Diptych. It's edited by Dillian Gordon, Lisa Monas and Caroline Elam. I've written about the picture in my own book, The Invention of British Art, and that makes basically the case I've just described in this podcast, but it has all the extra footnotes and all the bits of evidence you might like to see for yourself to see if my case stacks up. And finally, also online, you can find an extensive catalogue entry by the National Gallery itself, all about the picture, on their website. So that's it. Have a good week, and see you next time.
Waldy and Bendy.